Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their child. But Jack Rowan has been living that nightmare for 11 long years. His 6-year-old daughter Lily disappeared one afternoon after getting off the school bus. And despite countless searches and sleepless nights, she simply vanished without a trace. On a quiet afternoon, Jack was cleaning out Lily's bedroom when he found an old folder of her drawings. One picture stopped him cold. It showed Lily with 2 other kids and a woman, standing in front of a house with a heart shape on the door. Jack had seen this house before. He drove past it every day on his work route. And the little girl in the drawing looked exactly like a child he'd just spotted playing in that yard. But if Lily drew this house before she disappeared, how could she have known about a place she'd never been? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Rowan's hands trembled as he held the drawing, studying every crayon mark as if it might reveal secrets hidden in its innocent lines. The small pink backpack sitting on Lily's dresser seemed to watch him, the last piece of her that had been found that terrible October day 11 years ago. It was discovered at the bus stop where she should have been picked up, abandoned and empty, except for her homework and a half-eaten apple that had turned brown by the time the police arrived. He set the drawing down carefully and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had once felt safe. Maple Street was quiet in the afternoon light, the same as it had been on that day when his world shattered. Mrs. Chen from next door was tending her garden, the same ritual she'd maintained for the 15 years he'd known her. Some things never changed, while others disappeared without warning. The bedroom remained exactly as Lily had left it. Her bed was still unmade from that final morning when she'd rushed downstairs for breakfast, complaining about a math test she'd forgotten to study for. Her stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, sat, propped against the pillows where she'd placed him before school. The bookshelf held her collection of picture books, many with corners worn soft from repeated readings. Even her clothes hung in the closet, tiny dresses and sweaters that would never fit her now if she was even still alive. Jack was 45 years old and looked older. 11 years of grief had carved deep lines around his eyes and silvered his dark hair prematurely. His construction work kept him physically strong, but emotionally he felt hollow, going through the motions of living without really being alive. Most days he survived on coffee and stubborn determination, occasionally remembering to eat when his neighbor reminded him or when his stomach demanded attention. The day Lily disappeared had started like any other. He'd made her breakfast, scrambled, eggs and toast cut into triangles the way she liked it. She'd worn her favorite purple sweater and the little sneakers with lights that blinked when she walked. Her backpack was new then, bright pink and covered with cartoon characters she'd outgrown but refused to replace. "Daddy, will you help me with my math homework tonight?" she'd asked, swinging her legs from the kitchen chair. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll work on it right after dinner." Those were the last words they'd ever spoken to each other. Emma, his wife, had been gone for 2 years by then, lost to the cancer that had eaten away at their family slowly, giving them time to say goodbye, but never enough time to prepare for the emptiness. Lily had been his anchor after Emma's death, the reason he got up each morning, and the source of whatever joy remained in his life. Losing her had felt like drowning in open water with no shore in sight. The police had done everything they could. Detective Sarah Martinez, a kind woman with gentle eyes and infinite patience, had worked Lily's case for 3 years before her retirement. She'd interviewed everyone on the street, checked every database, followed every lead, no matter how small or unlikely. The case had received media attention for months, with Lily's school photo appearing on missing person flyers and news programs. But as time passed and leads dried up, the investigation had grown cold. Jack picked up the drawing again, focusing on the details that had stopped his breath. The house was rendered in the simple style of a 6-year-old, but the proportions were surprisingly accurate. The front door was painted blue with that distinctive heart-shaped knocker. 2 windows flanked the entrance, and a small flower garden bordered the front walk. Most remarkably, Lily had drawn herself holding hands with 2 other children, a boy slightly taller than her and a girl about her own age, while a woman with long brown hair stood behind them, her arms outstretched as if gathering them all in an embrace. The woman in the drawing looked nothing like Emma, who had been blonde and petite. This woman was taller, with features that suggested kindness and warmth. Lily had drawn her wearing a yellow dress and a smile that seemed to radiate from the page. Jack's delivery route for Henderson Construction took him through dozens of neighborhoods across the county. He'd driven past the Hartwell house on Sycamore Lane hundreds of times without really seeing it, the way you stop noticing familiar landmarks. But now, with Lily's drawing in his hands, every detail seemed significant. The blue door with its heart-shaped knocker, the 2 front windows with their white shutters, the small garden where someone had planted daffodils and roses, and the little girl he'd glimpsed playing in the yard just 2 days ago. She'd been running with a dog, her dark hair streaming behind her, laughing at something only she could hear. In that brief moment before his truck had passed by, she'd looked up, and Jack had seen a face that could have been Lily's. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same expression of pure joy that he remembered from better days. Mrs. Chen knocked on the front door around dinner time, as she had every few days for the past 11 years. She carried a covered dish and wore the patient expression of someone who'd made it her mission to keep him fed and somewhat connected to the world. "Jack, you need to eat," she said, not waiting for an invitation to come inside. At 73, she was small and fierce, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "I made too much stir-fry again. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You don't have to keep doing this. I know I don't have to. I want to." She set the dish on his kitchen counter and turned to study his face. "You look different today." Something happened. He'd learned not to try hiding things from her. She had an uncanny ability to read people, developed over decades of raising 5 children and managing a household that had always been the neighborhood gathering place. "I found something of Lily's, a drawing I'd never seen before." Her expression softened. "May I see it?" Jack retrieved the drawing from the bedroom and placed it on the kitchen table. Mrs. Chen put on her reading glasses and examined it carefully, taking her time with each detail. "This is very detailed for a child her age," she observed. "Lily was always artistic, but this shows real observation. She drew this from memory, not imagination." "That's what I was thinking. The house. I know where it is. I drive past it every day for work." Mrs. Chen looked up at him sharply. "You're thinking of investigating?" It wasn't a question. She knew him well enough to recognize the determined set of his jaw and the new light in his eyes, the first real spark of hope she'd seen since the early days after Lily's disappearance. "I have to," he said simply. "If there's even a chance, there's always a chance until you know for certain." She folded the drawing carefully and handed it back to him. "But you must be prepared for disappointment, Jack, and you must be careful not to let hope become obsession." That night, Jack sat in his living room with a beer he didn't really want and stared at the drawing propped against the coffee table. The house looked back at him from the paper, innocent and inviting, promising answers to questions he'd been asking for 11 years. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. Porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, children being called inside for baths and bedtime stories. He thought about Emma and what she would have said about his discovery. She'd always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his emotions threatened to overwhelm his judgment. But she'd also been fiercely protective of their daughter, and Jack knew she would have wanted him to pursue every possibility, no matter how remote. The pink backpack sat on the mantel where he'd placed it after the police had finished their investigation. It was the only concrete evidence that Lily had ever existed in the world beyond this house, the only proof that she'd been real and loved and missed every single day since her disappearance. Sometimes he caught himself listening for the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, or her voice calling from the kitchen, asking for help with homework or permission to watch one more television show. Detective Martinez had told him once that hope was both a blessing and a curse for families of missing children. It kept you going when logic said to give up, but it could also trap you in a prison of endless waiting and false leads. She'd seen parents destroy themselves chasing shadows, unable to accept that sometimes people simply vanished without explanation or resolution. But this was different. This drawing was evidence, concrete, tangible proof that Lily had known about something or somewhere before her disappearance. And if she'd drawn this house from memory, it meant she'd been there. The question was when and why and what had happened to her afterward. Jack finished his beer and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would drive to Sycamore Lane not as someone simply passing through, but as a father following the only lead he'd had in years. He would find out who lived in that house, who the woman in the yellow dress might be, and whether the little girl with dark hair and his daughter's smile was somehow connected to the mystery that had consumed his life. The drawing seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, its crayon colors bright against the white paper. Lily had always been careful with her artwork, taking time to stay within the lines and choosing her colors thoughtfully. This drawing showed the same careful attention to detail, the same love of precision that had made her homework so neat and her room so organized. "I'm coming, sweetheart," he whispered to the empty room. "Daddy's going to find out what happened to you." For the first time in 11 years, Jack Rowan went to sleep with something besides grief filling his heart. It was fragile and dangerous and probably foolish, but it was hope. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel as he turned onto Sycamore Lane, his heart hammering against his ribs. The morning was crisp and clear, with autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalks like nature's confetti. He'd called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Unable to concentrate on anything except the drawing folded in his shirt pocket and the possibility that lay ahead. The Hartwell house sat halfway down the block, distinguished from its neighbors by the mature oak tree in the front yard and the meticulous landscaping that spoke of careful attention. Jack parked across the street, 3 houses down, where he could observe without being obvious. His truck blended in with the other work vehicles in the neighborhood. Contractors and service technicians were common in these suburban streets. The house looked exactly as Lily had drawn it. The blue front door gleamed in the morning sunlight, and there, centered perfectly, was the heart-shaped door knocker that had seemed too specific to be coincidental. It was brass, weathered to a warm patina that suggested years of use. The 2 front windows flanked the entrance symmetrically, their white shutters freshly painted. The small garden bloomed with late-season flowers, mums and asters in shades of purple and gold. Jack pulled out his phone and took several photos, then compared them to Lily's drawing. The proportions were remarkably accurate for a 6-year-old's artwork. She'd even captured the slight curve of the front walk and the way the flower bed bordered the path to the door. It was as if she'd stood in this exact spot, studying the house with an artist's eye for detail. A SUV pulled into the driveway and Jack's pulse quickened. A woman emerged from the driver's side, tall, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the sunlight. She wore jeans and a green cardigan, and when she turned toward the house, Jack could see her profile clearly. She was attractive in an understated way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This could be the woman from Lily's drawing, aged 11 years. The passenger door opened, and a young girl climbed out. Jack's breath caught in his throat. She was perhaps 16 or 17 now, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a face that made his chest tighten with recognition. The shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she moved with unconscious grace. It was like watching a ghost made flesh. This girl could be Lily, the woman, presumably Margaret Hartwell. According to the property records Jack had looked up online, called something to the girl, who laughed in response. The sound carried across the street, bright and musical, and Jack felt tears blur his vision. Lily had laughed like that, with her whole heart. finding joy in the smallest things. They gathered shopping bags from the car and walked toward the house together. The woman's arm draped casually around the girl's shoulders in a gesture of easy affection. Jack watched them disappear through the blue door, the heart-shaped knocker glinting as it swung closed behind them. He sat in his truck for 2 hours, taking photos whenever someone appeared and making notes in a small notebook he'd brought. A man emerged around noon, David Hartwell, Jack assumed, to check the mailbox. He was average height with graying hair and the soft build of someone who worked behind a desk. He wore khakis and a polo shirt, the uniform of suburban fathers everywhere. When he walked back to the house, he paused to deadhead some flowers in the garden, working with the patience of someone who found peace in small, methodical tasks. The girl appeared at the front window several times, sometimes talking on a phone, sometimes just looking out at the street. Each time Jack saw her face, his conviction grew stronger. The resemblance to Lily, to how Lily might look now, was too strong to be coincidental. That evening, Jack drove to the small office where Detective Sarah Martinez ran her private investigation business. She'd opened the practice after retiring from the police force, specializing in cold cases and missing persons. Her office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a dry cleaner, but inside it was warm and professional, with certificates on the walls and filing cabinets that spoke of serious work. "Jack," she said, rising from behind her desk with a welcoming smile. "It's good to see you. How are you holding up?" Sarah Martinez was in her early 60s now, with silver hair she wore in a neat bob and dark eyes that had seen too much suffering but hadn't lost their compassion. She'd worked Lily's case with dedication that went beyond professional duty, and Jack knew she still thought about his daughter. "I found something," he said without preamble, pulling out Lily's drawing. This was in her bedroom, in a folder I'd never seen before. Sarah put on her reading glasses and studied the drawing carefully, just as Mrs. Chen had done. But where his neighbor had shown maternal concern, the detective's expression was professionally neutral, weighing possibilities and probabilities. "The detail is impressive," she said finally. "This isn't fantasy art, this looks like observation. I know where this house is. I've been driving past it for years on my delivery route." Sarah looked up sharply. "You've been to see it?" "This morning. There's a family living there, the Hartwells. David, Margaret, and a teenage girl they call Sophie. Jack, she looks like Lily, Sarah. I know how that sounds, but the resemblance is unmistakable. The right age, the right coloring, the same facial structure." Sarah set the drawing down carefully and leaned back in her chair. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you're feeling right now, this hope, this certainty, I've seen it destroy families. Parents who become so convinced they've found their missing child that they lose all objectivity. I'm not losing objectivity. I'm being careful, methodical. You called in sick to work to surveil a family's home. That's not careful, Jack. That's the beginning of obsession." The words stung because they carried truth. Jack felt the familiar anger rising, the same frustration he'd experienced during the original investigation when well-meaning people had tried to manage his emotions and expectations. "So what am I supposed to do? Ignore the first real lead I've had in 11 years? "No," Sarah said gently. "You're supposed to let me investigate it properly. If there's something here, I'll find it. But you need to step back and let me do my job." Jack wanted to argue, but he recognized the wisdom in her words. Sarah had resources and experience he lacked. She could access databases and records that weren't available to civilians. Most importantly, she could investigate without the emotional baggage that clouded his judgment. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you remember about the drawing, where exactly you found it, whether you'd seen it before, anything Lily might have said about drawing houses or new friends. And I need you to promise me you'll stay away from that house while I work." Jack hesitated. The promise felt like abandonment, like giving up the first thread of hope he'd found. But Sarah was right. His emotional investment could compromise any investigation. "I promise," he said reluctantly. "Good. Give me a week to do some preliminary research. Property records, background checks, school enrollment records. If this girl is your daughter, there will be documentation somewhere that doesn't add up. Jack left Sarah's office feeling simultaneously hopeful and frustrated. The rational part of his mind knew she was right to proceed cautiously, but his heart wanted to march up to the Hartwells' front door and demand answers. He'd waited 11 years for a break in the case. Waiting another week seemed almost unbearable. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with Lily's drawing spread before him, studying every line and color choice. The heart-shaped door knocker seemed to wink at him in the lamplight, as if it held secrets just waiting to be unlocked. He thought about the girl he'd seen, Sophie Hartwell, and tried to imagine Lily growing up in that house, with that family. The thought brought a complex mix of emotions. If Sophie was indeed Lily, then his daughter was alive and apparently well cared for. She'd grown up in a comfortable home with parents who obviously loved her, but she'd also grown up without him, believing herself to be someone else entirely. Jack picked up his phone 3 times to call Sarah and ask her to work faster, then forced himself to put it down. Patience had never been his strength, but 11 years of waiting had taught him that good investigations took time. If he'd learned anything from his daughter's disappearance, it was that rushing led to mistakes. And mistakes in missing person cases could mean the difference between reunion and permanent loss. He carefully placed the drawing in a protective folder and put it on the mantel next to Lily's pink backpack. 2 artifacts from his daughter's life, separated by years but connected by possibility. Tomorrow, he would go back to work and try to maintain normal routines while Sarah did what she did best. But tonight, for the first time in 11 years, Jack Rowan fell asleep believing his daughter might still be alive. The week crawled by with the speed of molasses in winter. Jack threw himself into work with desperate energy, hoping physical exhaustion would quiet the constant churning in his mind. He framed houses, installed drywall, and hauled materials until his back ached and his hands were raw. But nothing could stop him from thinking about the girl with dark hair who might be his daughter. Emma's wedding ring caught the afternoon sunlight as Jack adjusted his grip on a 2x4. He still wore it on his right hand, having moved it there after her death, but unable to take it off completely. The simple gold band had become a talisman, a reminder of the family he'd lost and the love that had shaped the best years of his life. Emma would have known what to do about the drawing, about Sophie Hartwell, about the impossible hope that had taken root in his chest. "Jack, you're pushing too hard," his foreman Mike Rodriguez called from across the job site. "Take a break before you hurt yourself." Mike was a good man who'd carried Jack through the worst periods of his grief, covering for him when he couldn't function and never asking for explanations. At 55, he'd raised 4 children of his own and understood that some wounds never fully healed. Jack set down his tools and accepted the bottle of water Mike offered. They sat on a stack of lumber, looking out at the half-finished house that would soon shelter another family's dreams and secrets. "Something's different about you this week," Mike observed. "Not worse different, better different." "What's going on?" Jack considered deflecting, but Mike had earned honesty through years of patience and friendship. "I might have found a lead about Lily." Mike's eyebrows rose. "After all this time, I found a drawing she made before she disappeared. It shows a house I know with people I've never seen before. There's a family living there now with a teenage girl who could be—" Jack stopped, unable to finish the sentence out loud. "Could be her." "Yeah." Mike was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "That's a hell of a thing, Jack. What are you going to do?" "A private investigator is looking into it. Sarah Martinez. She worked Lily's original case." "Good. Professional help is what you need." Mike paused. "But I need to ask, are you prepared for this to be another dead end?" The question hit harder than Jack expected. He'd been so focused on the possibility that Sophie was Lily that he hadn't fully considered what would happen if the investigation proved otherwise. Another crushing disappointment might finally break what remained of his spirit. "I have to try," he said simply. "If there's even a chance she's alive, then you follow it until you know for sure. Just don't lose yourself in the process." That evening, Jack found himself driving through Sycamore Lane despite his promise to Sarah. He told himself he was just taking a different route home, but he slowed as he passed the Hartwell house. The blue door with its heart-shaped knocker seemed to beckon to him, holding secrets just beyond his reach. A light was on in what appeared to be a teenager's bedroom, the second-floor window on the left side of the house. Jack could see the silhouette of someone moving around inside, and his imagination filled in details he couldn't actually observe. Was she doing homework? Talking to friends? Did she ever think about a life before this one? Or had 11 years erased all memory of her first 6 years? Mrs. Chen was waiting on his front porch when he pulled into his driveway, her expression making it clear she'd noticed his extended absence. "You're supposed to be staying away from that house," she said without preamble. "I didn't stop. I just drove by. Jack Rowan, I've known you for 15 years, and I can read your face like a picture book. You're becoming obsessed with that family." He wanted to deny it, but the evidence was overwhelming. He'd driven by the house every day since discovering it, sometimes multiple times. He'd looked up the Hartwells online, learning that David worked in accounting and Margaret was a part-time nurse. He'd found their social media profiles and studied every photo that showed their daughter, searching for resemblances to Lily and Emma. What if she's my daughter, Mrs. Chen? What if Lily is alive and living 10 minutes away from me? Then the investigator will discover that and help you figure out what to do next. But what if she's not? What if you're putting all your hope into a girl who just happens to look like how you imagine Lily might look now? The possibility terrified him more than he wanted to admit. For 11 years, he'd lived with the awful uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to his daughter. At least grief had an endpoint. Missing was eternal, a wound that could never heal because there was nothing to heal from. "I can't stop thinking about her," Jack admitted. "About what her life has been like. Whether she's happy, whether she remembers us at all." Mrs. Chen's expression softened. "Of course you can't, but you need to be careful not to project your need onto an innocent family. If this girl is not Lily, you could cause tremendous harm by pursuing her." That night, Jack sat in Emma's old chair by the window, holding her wedding ring up to the light. He remembered the day he'd proposed, how nervous he'd been, despite knowing she would say yes. They'd been so young then, so certain that love would be enough to protect them from the world's cruelties. They'd planned for children and careers and growing old together, never imagining that cancer would take her at 38, or that their daughter would vanish without explanation. Emma had been pragmatic about most things, but she'd also believed in following her instincts when logic failed. What would she tell him about Sophie Hartwell? Would she encourage him to pursue the possibility, or would she warn him about the dangers of false hope? He found himself talking to her, as he often did, in the quiet hours before sleep. "I don't know what to do, Em. This could be our little girl, but it could also be wishful thinking. How do I tell the difference between hope and delusion?" The house remained silent, offering no answers. But Emma's ring caught the lamplight, and Jack chose to interpret that as encouragement. Tomorrow he would call Sarah and see if she'd learned anything about the Hartwell family's history. His phone rang at 7 the next morning, Sarah's number appearing on the screen. "I've got some preliminary information," she said without greeting. "Can you meet me at the office this afternoon?" "What did you find?" "I'd rather discuss it in person. But Jack, prepare yourself for the fact that this might not be the answer you're hoping for." The rest of the workday passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Jack made mistakes he hadn't made in years, measuring wrong and having to recut lumber twice. Mike finally sent him home early, recognizing that his mind was elsewhere entirely. Sarah's office felt smaller than Jack remembered, crowded with filing cabinets and the weight of accumulated sorrows. She had a folder open on her desk, filled with printouts and photocopied documents. "The Hartwells have lived at that address for 12 years, she began. "They moved there about a year after your daughter disappeared. David works for a regional accounting firm. Margaret is a registered nurse who works part-time at the county hospital. No criminal records, no financial troubles, no red flags in their background." Jack felt his heart sinking. "What about their daughter?" "That's where it gets interesting. According to public records, Sophie Margaret Hartwell was adopted by them in November 2012. She would have been approximately 6 years old at the time. The dates aligned perfectly with Lily's disappearance. Jack's pulse quickened. Where did she come from? That's what I'm still working on. The adoption was handled through a private agency called New Beginnings Family Services. They specialized in placing older children who were difficult to adopt through traditional channels. Can you get the adoption records? Not easily. Private adoption records are sealed, and I'd need a court order to access them. But I can investigate the agency itself, see if there were any irregularities in their operations around that time. Jack stared at the folder, wanting to reach for it, but afraid of what he might find. What's your professional opinion? Could Sophie be Lily? Sarah was quiet for a moment, weighing her words. The timeline is right, and the physical resemblance you described is certainly possible. But Jack, thousands of children are adopted every year. The fact that this one happened around the same time as Lily's disappearance could be pure coincidence, but it could also be more than coincidence. Yes, it could. That's why I'm going to keep investigating. But I need you to understand something. Even if Sophie is Lily, that doesn't necessarily mean she was kidnapped. There are other possibilities. Jack's mind raced through scenarios he didn't want to consider. What kind of possibilities? She could have wandered away and been found by someone who assumed she was abandoned. She could have been in an accident that caused memory loss. There are dozens of ways a child could end up in the system without foul play being involved. The thought that Lily might have been out there all these years, needing him while he searched frantically, was almost unbearable. But it was better than the alternative, that she was gone forever. How long will it take to investigate the adoption agency? A few more days, maybe a week. These things take time, especially when you're trying not to tip off the people involved. Jack left the office with more questions than answers, but also with the first real progress he'd had since finding the drawing. Emma's ring felt warm against his finger as he drove home, and he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to have his daughter back. Jack couldn't stop looking at Lily's school photo. It sat on his kitchen table beside his morning coffee, the image of his 6-year-old daughter smiling back at him with gap-toothed joy. Her dark hair was pulled back in the pigtails she'd insisted on that morning, and she wore the purple sweater that had been her favorite. In the photo, her eyes sparkled with the innocent happiness of a child who believed the world was fundamentally good. Now he found himself comparing that image to his brief glimpses of Sophie Hartwell, trying to age the features in his mind and account for 11 years of growth and change. The shape of the eyes seemed similar, and the stubborn set of the jaw that Emma had always said came from his side of the family. But photographs could be deceiving, and memory was unreliable when filtered through desperate hope. The Harvest Festival at Riverside Park provided the perfect opportunity for closer observation. Jack had seen the flyers posted around town and remembered that families from all the local neighborhoods typically attended. It would be natural for the Hartwells to be there, and equally natural for him to attend as well. He'd gone every year with Lily before her disappearance, and occasionally since then when Mrs. Chen insisted he needed to get out of the house. The festival was in full swing when Jack arrived Saturday afternoon. Children ran between booths selling caramel apples and hot cider, while parents chatted and watched jack-o'-lantern carving demonstrations. The air smelled of kettle corn and autumn leaves, triggering memories of better times when he'd carried Lily on his shoulders so she could see over the crowds. He bought a cup of coffee he didn't want and found a bench near the children's activity area, positioning himself where he could observe without being obvious. The familiar ache of watching other people's children play hit him as it always did, but today it was tempered by purpose. 20 minutes later, he spotted them. David and Margaret Hartwell walked hand in hand through the crowd, with Sophie trailing slightly behind, her attention focused on her phone. She wore jeans and a red sweater that brought out the darkness of her hair. And when she looked up to respond to something her mother said, Jack felt his breath catch. The resemblance to Lily was even stronger in person. Not just the physical features, but something in her expression, a thoughtful intelligence that reminded him of the way his daughter had studied the world around her. Lily had always been observant, noticing details that adults missed and asking questions that revealed an active, curious mind. Jack watched as the family stopped at a booth selling handmade crafts. Margaret examined some pottery, while David and Sophie looked at wooden toys and decorations. The interaction between them seemed natural and affectionate. Margaret ruffled Sophie's hair when she made a joke, and David put his arm around both of them when they posed for a photo with their purchases. They looked like a family, a real family, with shared history and inside jokes and the easy intimacy that came from years of living together. If Sophie was indeed Lily, then these people had raised her, loved her, and given her the stable childhood that Jack's grief might not have been able to provide. The thought was both comforting and devastating. Sophie broke away from her parents to get in line for face painting, and Jack found himself moving closer without conscious decision. He positioned himself at a nearby booth, pretending to examine handmade jewelry while keeping her in his peripheral vision. She was beautiful, 17 years old, and growing into the kind of young woman that Emma would have been proud to see their daughter become. She laughed easily with the other teenagers in line, displaying a confidence and social ease that suggested she'd been well loved and encouraged throughout her childhood. "Excuse me, are you looking for anything specific?" Jack turned to find the jewelry vendor, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, watching him with gentle concern. "Just browsing," he managed, realizing he'd been staring at nothing for several minutes. "That's a lovely young lady you've been watching," the woman observed, with the directness that came with age. "Your daughter?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. No, she's not. But was she? Standing 15 feet away from the girl who might be Lily, Jack felt the same protective instinct that had driven him to check on his daughter every night before bed. The same fierce love that had made losing her feel like losing a part of his soul. Sophie reached the front of the face painting line and chose a butterfly design in blue and silver. She sat patiently while the artist worked, occasionally glancing around at the crowd. For one heart-stopping moment, her gaze passed over Jack, and he saw Emma in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her smile. When the face painting was finished, Sophie admired herself in the small mirror the artist provided, then rejoined her parents with obvious pleasure in her appearance. Margaret hugged her and said something that made her laugh, and Jack felt tears threatening. This was what he'd wanted for Lily, a happy adolescence with parents who celebrated her joy and supported her dreams. But he'd also wanted to be one of those parents. The Hartwells moved toward the exit as the afternoon grew late, and Jack made a decision that went against every promise he'd made to Sarah Martinez. He followed them at a distance, staying far enough back to avoid notice, but close enough to observe their interactions. They stopped at an ice cream truck, where Sophie got a cone with rainbow sprinkles, while her parents shared a single vanilla cone between them. David said something that made Margaret laugh so hard she nearly choked on her ice cream, and Sophie rolled her eyes with the fond exasperation of a teenager whose parents were embarrassing but beloved. Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Where are you?" "Dinner is ready." He realized he'd been following the Hartwells for over an hour, watching them like a private investigator or a stalker. The thought disturbed him, but not enough to make him stop. He was learning things about Sophie that no background check could reveal. That she was polite to strangers, affectionate with her parents, and comfortable in her own skin, in the way that well-adjusted children were. The family reached their car, a sensible sedan that spoke of middle-class stability. Sophie climbed into the back seat while her parents loaded their festival purchases into the trunk. Just before getting in the driver's seat, David looked around the parking lot with the casual awareness of a man checking his surroundings. His gaze passed over Jack's position by the trees, and for a moment their eyes met. David's expression was puzzled rather than alarmed, as if he was trying to place a face he thought he recognized. Jack forced himself to turn away and walk toward his own truck, his heart pounding with the fear of discovery. That night, he spread Lily's school photo and his phone photos of Sophie side by side on the kitchen table. The resemblance was undeniable, but it was also inconclusive. Features that seemed identical in one light looked different in another. The shape of the nose could have come from any parent, and teenage faces often changed dramatically from their childhood proportions. Mrs. Chen knocked on his door, just as he was putting the photos away. "You went to see that family again," she said, reading his expression with her usual accuracy. "I went to the Harvest Festival. They happened to be there. Jack, you're walking a dangerous line. What you're doing, following them, watching them, it's not healthy. And it could be illegal. I'm not following them. I need to know if she's Lily." Mrs. Chen sat down across from him and took his hands in hers. Her fingers were small and warm, bearing the calluses of decades of cooking and gardening and caring for others. "I understand that need. I do. But what if this obsession destroys your ability to accept whatever the truth turns out to be? What if you become so convinced that this girl is your daughter that you can't see clearly anymore?" Jack wanted to argue, but her words carried the weight of genuine concern. He'd seen his own behavior changing over the past week. The constant drive-bys, the internet searches, the way he'd followed a family through a public festival like some kind of predator. "I just want my daughter back," he said quietly. "I know. But wanting something desperately doesn't make it true. And if this girl is not Lily, your behavior could frighten an innocent family and harm a child who's done nothing wrong." That night, Jack lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about parallel lives. Somewhere in the city, Sophie Hartwell was probably doing homework or texting friends or watching television with her parents. She was living the normal teenage life that should have been Lily's, surrounded by people who loved her and protected her. If she was Lily, then she'd spent the past 11 years believing herself to be someone else, with no memory of her first family or the father who'd never stopped looking for her. The thought of all the missed birthdays and bedtime stories and school plays made his chest tight with loss. But if she wasn't Lily, then he was transferring all his grief and hope onto an innocent girl who deserved to live her life without the weight of his expectations. Jack reached for his phone to call Sarah Martinez, then forced himself to put it down. She'd said she needed more time to investigate the adoption agency, and pushing her for faster results wouldn't change the facts. All he could do was wait and try to maintain the boundaries he'd promised to respect. Emma's ring caught the moonlight from the bedside table, and Jack found himself talking to his wife again. "I think I'm losing my objectivity, Em. I want Sophie to be Lily so badly that I might be seeing things that aren't there. How do I know if what I'm feeling is intuition or desperation?" The room remained silent, but Emma's ring seemed to glow with warmth and understanding. Tomorrow he would try to be patient. Tomorrow he would focus on work and normal life and let the professionals do their job. But tonight, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to tell Sophie Hartwell who she really was, and to see recognition dawn in eyes that might remember loving him once upon a time. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, while Jack was installing kitchen cabinets in a new development across town. Sarah Martinez's number appeared on his screen just as he was measuring for the final upper cabinet, and he nearly dropped his level in his haste to answer. "I've got news about New Beginnings Family Services," Sarah said without preamble. "Can you meet me at lunch?" Jack glanced at his watch. It was barely 10 in the morning, but the next few hours felt like they would stretch into eternity. "What did you find?" "I'd rather discuss it in person." "But Jack, this isn't straightforward. There are some irregularities that raise questions." The drive to Sarah's office took 25 minutes, but Jack made it in 18, his mind racing through possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. Irregularities could mean Sophie's adoption had been handled improperly, which might support his theory that she was Lily, but they could also mean something else, entirely, something that would shatter the fragile hope he'd been nurturing. Sarah had coffee waiting, and a thick folder spread across her desk. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Jack had learned to read the subtle signs of her moods during the original investigation. She was troubled by whatever she'd discovered. New Beginnings Family Services closed down in 2015, she began, settling into her chair. The state revoked their license after an investigation into their practices. Multiple violations, including inadequate background checks and falsified documentation. Jack felt his pulse quicken. What kind of falsified documentation? Birth certificates, medical records, background histories of children in their care. The state investigation found that the agency was placing children without proper verification of their identities or legal status. The implications hit Jack like a sledgehammer. If New Beginnings had been operating illegally, then Sophie's adoption might not have been legitimate. She could have been placed with the Hartwells without proper documentation of who she really was or where she'd come from. Do you have Sophie's specific records? Sarah pulled out a heavily redacted document. Most of the text was blacked out, but Jack could see Sophie's name and the date of her placement with the Hartwells. This is all I could access without a court order. But look at this. She pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. The child's previous placement history shows 3 different foster homes in the 18 months before her adoption. That's unusual for a successful placement. Jack studied the document, trying to decipher the limited information available. What does that suggest? It could mean she was a difficult placement, behavioral problems, attachment issues, medical needs. Or it could mean there were questions about her legal status that made permanent placement complicated. Questions like what? Like whether she was legally free for adoption. Like whether her identity had been properly established. Like whether someone was still looking for her. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jack felt Emma's ring pressing against his finger, warm and reassuring. What's our next step? I'm going to try to track down some of the former employees of New Beginnings. People who might remember specific cases or be willing to talk about what they saw. It's a long shot, but if there was something irregular about Sophie's case, someone might remember. Jack nodded, though part of him wanted to march straight to the Hartwell house and demand answers. How long will that take? A few days, maybe a week. These people scattered when the agency closed, and some of them might not want to talk about what happened there. What about the Hartwells? Do they know about the agency's problems? Sarah's expression grew more serious. That's what worries me. If they adopted Sophie through New Beginnings, they received notice when the state investigation began. They would have been informed that their daughter's adoption might have irregularities, the thought that the Hartwells might know. Something was wrong with Sophie's adoption while continuing to raise her as their own. Daughter was both infuriating and understandable. If they'd grown to love her, would they risk losing her by revealing potential problems with her legal status? Jack left Sarah's office feeling like he was walking through a minefield. Every step forward revealed new dangers and complications, but stopping meant giving up the first real lead he'd had in 11 years. The social services file felt like evidence, but evidence of what exactly remained unclear. That afternoon, he found himself driving past the Hartwell house again, despite his promises and better judgment. The blue door, with its heart-shaped knocker, seemed to mock him now, hiding secrets that felt tantalizingly close to discovery. A car was in the driveway, Margaret's SUV, and Jack could see movement in the front windows. What were they doing in there? Did they discuss Sophie's past, or was it a forbidden topic that threatened the stability they'd built? Did Sophie ask questions about her early childhood, or had she accepted the story her parents told her without question? Jack's phone buzzed with a text message, startling him from his surveillance. The message was from an unknown number. Stop watching our family or we'll call the police. His blood turned to ice. Someone had noticed his repeated visits to Sycamore Lane and felt threatened enough to send a warning. Jack looked up at the Hartwell house, wondering if someone was watching him, even as he watched them. The windows revealed nothing, but he felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that made his skin crawl. He drove home quickly, his hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The text message proved that his behavior had crossed a line from careful observation into stalking. If the Hartwells called the police, any chance of learning the truth about Sophie would disappear. and he could face charges that would destroy what remained of his life. Mrs. Chen was waiting on his front porch again, her expression grave. She held up her phone, showing him the same text message. "They sent it to me too," she said quietly. "They must have done some research and found out we're neighbors. Jack, this has gone too far." He wanted to defend his actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. He'd become the kind of person who frightened families and generated anonymous threats. The realization made him sick with shame and self-loathing. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, sinking into the porch chair beside her. "I know you didn't, but good intentions don't matter if the result is harmful. You need to stop this before it destroys you and hurts innocent people." That night, Jack called Sarah Martinez and told her about the text message. Her silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes about her professional assessment of the situation. "You've compromised the investigation," she said finally. "If the Hartwells are suspicious enough to send warnings, they'll be on guard against any inquiries about Sophie's background. I'm sorry. I know what You're a father who wants his daughter back. But you've potentially sabotaged our only chance of learning the truth." The next morning brought another devastating blow. Jack's supervisor at Henderson Construction called him into the office and placed him on unpaid leave, pending a review of his recent performance. Too many sick days, too many mistakes, too many instances of being physically present but mentally absent. "I like you, Jack," Mike Rodriguez said with genuine regret. "You're a good worker when your head's in the game. But lately, your head's been somewhere else entirely, and that's dangerous on a construction site." Jack nodded, unable to argue with the assessment. His obsession with Sophie Hartwell had consumed his life, to the point where he couldn't function in the real world. He was losing his job, alienating his neighbors, and potentially destroying his only chance of finding his daughter. The irony was crushing. In his desperate search for Lily, he was becoming the kind of man she wouldn't want to be found by. Unstable, obsessive, potentially dangerous. Emma would have been horrified by his behavior. And Lily, if she was out there somewhere, deserved better than a father who'd lost himself in the search for her. That afternoon, Jack sat in his kitchen with the social services file spread before him, studying the redacted document for clues he might have missed. The 3 foster home placements before Sophie's adoption with the Hartwells suggested a troubled history, but they could also indicate a child who'd been traumatized by separation from her original family. If Sophie was Lily, what had she experienced in those 18 months between her disappearance and her adoption? Had she been kidnapped and held somewhere? Had she escaped or been abandoned by her captors? The possibilities were horrifying to contemplate, but they might explain why she'd needed multiple placements before finding stability with the Hartwells. Jack's phone rang, and Sarah Martinez's number appeared on the screen. He answered with trepidation, expecting more bad news about his interference with the investigation. "I found someone," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and caution. "A former social worker from New Beginnings who's willing to talk. But Jack, you need to prepare yourself. What she told me raises more questions than it answers." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about whether Sophie Hartwell is who the adoption records say she is. Questions about what New Beginnings knew about her background and why they didn't investigate further." Jack felt hope and terror warring in his chest. "When can we meet with her?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "But Jack, I need you to promise me something. Whatever we learn, you cannot act on it independently. If Sophie is Lily, this situation is going to require legal intervention and extreme care. One wrong move could traumatize that girl and destroy any chance of a positive outcome," Jack promised, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Emma's ring seemed heavier on his finger, reminding him of the husband and father he'd once been. Someone thoughtful and measured, someone who put his family's well-being above his own needs. Tomorrow he might finally learn the truth about Sophie Hartwell. But tonight he had to face the possibility that he'd become someone his wife and daughter wouldn't recognize, and decide whether he was strong enough to find his way back to the man they'd loved. The envelope arrived on Thursday morning, slipped under Jack's front door sometime during the night. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet with a message that made his blood run cold. Your daughter is safe and loved. Stop looking for her, or you'll destroy the life she's built. Some secrets are better left buried. This is your final warning. Jack read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. The anonymous text had been threatening, but this felt different, more personal, more desperate. Someone knew about his investigation and was trying to protect Sophie from whatever truth he might uncover. But protection from what exactly? He called Sarah Martinez immediately. This confirms that we're on the right track, she said after Jack read her the letter. Someone is worried enough about our investigation to escalate from texts to written warnings. That suggests they have something significant to hide. But what if they're right? What if learning the truth would hurt Sophie more than help her? Jack, listen to me carefully. If Sophie is your daughter, she has a right to know who she is. And you have a right to know what happened to your child. No one else gets to make that decision for you. The former social worker from New Beginnings agreed to meet them at a coffee shop in the next county, far from prying eyes and curious neighbors. Linda Vasquez was in her 50s now, with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much suffering in her professional life. She'd left social work entirely after the agency closed, moving into administrative work at a medical clinic. I remember the case you're asking about, she said without preamble, stirring sugar into her coffee with nervous energy. Sophie Hartwell, though that wasn't her name when she first came to us. Jack's heart stopped. What was her name? We called her Jane Doe, 47. She was found wandering in a parking lot outside Phoenix, Arizona, approximately 6 years old, no identification, no memory of how she got there or where she belonged. Sarah leaned forward, her detective instincts engaged. No memory at all? Selective amnesia, the psychologist said. Trauma-induced. She could speak normally and had basic social skills, but she couldn't tell us her name, where she lived, or anything about her family. We ran her through every missing children database we could access, but nothing came up. Jack felt dizzy. Nothing came up could mean the search hadn't been thorough enough, or it could mean Lily's case hadn't been entered into the right databases at the right time. In 2012, information sharing between agencies was less sophisticated than it became later. What happened next? Sarah asked. We placed her in emergency foster care while we tried to identify her. The first family couldn't handle her night terrors and behavioral problems. The second family was overwhelmed when she started having panic attacks. The third placement lasted 6 months before the foster parents said they couldn't meet her therapeutic needs. Linda paused, her expression growing troubled. That's when Margaret Hartwell contacted us. She was a nurse with experience in pediatric trauma, and she and her husband specifically requested a child with special needs. They were patient, understanding, and committed to providing whatever therapy and support Jane needed. So they knew she wasn't legally available for adoption. Jack asked, that's where things get complicated. My supervisor told me that Jane's legal status had been cleared through proper channels. But when I asked to see the documentation, I was told it was confidential and above my clearance. Level. Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Jack. That suggests someone higher up in the agency was involved in covering up irregularities. I always suspected. Something wasn't right, Linda continued. But I was a junior social worker with a caseload of 40-plus children. When my supervisor assured me that everything was handled properly, I didn't push back as hard as I should have. What made you suspicious? Jack asked. Several things. Jane's case file was unusually thin for a child with her history. Most trauma cases generate extensive documentation, medical records, psychological evaluations, therapy notes. But Jane's file contained the bare minimum, as if someone had deliberately kept records sparse. Linda pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. I kept my own notes back then. Just informal observations that didn't go in the official files. Would you like to hear what I recorded about Jane? Jack nodded, afraid to speak. Child shows signs of severe attachment disruption, but responds positively to consistent caregiving. Artistic abilities above average for age group. Draws detailed pictures of places and people she claims not to remember. Occasionally calls for someone named Jack during nightmares. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Sophie had called for him in her sleep, even after amnesia had stolen her conscious memories. Some part of her had remembered her father, even when the rest of her mind had built walls around the trauma. "There's more," Linda continued. Child becomes agitated when discussing family history, but shows no fear of potential adoptive parents. Seems to be looking for someone rather than running from someone. May have been separated from loving family rather than escaping abusive situation. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Jack's hand as tears rolled down his cheeks. After 11 years of wondering if his daughter had suffered, he was learning that she'd been calling for him in the darkness, that some part of her had never stopped believing he would find her. The Hartwells were perfect for her, Linda said gently. Margaret had experience with traumatized children, and David was patient and gentle. Within 6 months of placement, Jane's nightmares decreased, her anxiety improved, and she started forming healthy attachments. By the time the adoption was finalized, she seemed like a different child, but she was still our daughter, Jack said quietly. "I believe so, yes. The timing, the location where she was found, the physical description, it all fits with your missing child case. But proving it after all these years won't be simple." Sarah leaned forward. "What would it take to prove Sophie's identity definitively? DNA testing would be conclusive, but that would require cooperation from either Sophie or her adoptive parents. Medical records might show distinctive features or previous injuries that could be verified. School records from before her disappearance might contain information that could be compared to her current abilities and characteristics." The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, each contemplating the implications of what they'd learned. Sophie was almost certainly Lily, but she'd been living as someone else for 11 years. She had parents who loved her, a stable home, and a life built on the foundation of her new identity. "What happens if we prove she's Lily?" Jack asked. Linda's expression was grave. "That depends on a lot of factors. Her age, her wishes, the circumstances of how she ended up in the system, whether any laws were broken in her placement. At 17, her own preferences would carry significant weight in any custody determination." Jack thought about the girl he'd observed at the Harvest Festival. Confident, happy, secure in her relationships with the Hartwells. Would learning about her true identity enhance her life or destroy the stability she'd built? "There's something else you should know," Linda said, her voice dropping. "I heard rumors after the agency closed that some of the questionable placements involved children who weren't legally free for adoption, children whose disappearances had been reported, but whose cases hadn't been properly investigated. You think there were other children like Sophie? I think New Beginnings might have been part of a larger problem with the system. Children falling through cracks, paperwork being falsified, investigations being incomplete. Your daughter might not have been the only one." Jack left the meeting with more answers than he'd had in 11 years, but also with more questions about what to do with those answers. The anonymous letter writer had warned him that some secrets were better left buried, and he was beginning to understand why. Revealing Sophie's true identity would expose the failures that had separated them and potentially destroy the life she'd built with the Hartwells. But keeping silent would mean accepting that his daughter would never know who she really was, or that he'd never stopped loving her. That night, Jack sat in his kitchen with Emma's ring and Linda's notebook copies spread before him. The evidence was overwhelming. Sophie Hartwell was almost certainly his daughter Lily, lost for 11 years and found living 10 minutes away from him. But knowing the truth and acting on it were very different things. His phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "We know you met with Linda Vasquez. Stop now, or we'll make sure you never see Sophie again." Someone was watching his investigation closely enough to know about meetings he'd had hours ago. someone with resources and connections and a desperate need to keep the truth about Sophie's identity hidden. But who and why? Jack looked up at the ceiling and spoke to Emma again. "I found her, Em. Our little girl is alive and safe and loved, but bringing her home might destroy the home she's built. What do I do?" The house remained silent, but Emma's ring caught the lamplight and seemed to pulse with warmth. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to pursue the truth that could reunite his family or protect the peace that had let his daughter heal. The break-in was surprisingly easy. Jack had spent 30 years in construction and knew how to read the weaknesses in any building. The Hartwells' back door had a simple deadbolt and a window that could be reached by standing on their deck railing. He waited until he saw David's car leave for work and Margaret's SUV disappear toward the hospital where she worked her Tuesday shift. Jack knew what he was doing was wrong, criminal even, but the anonymous threats had pushed him past the point of rational decision-making. Someone was actively working to keep him from his daughter, and passive investigation was no longer enough. He needed answers, and those answers were likely somewhere inside the house where Sophie had grown up. The back door yielded to his credit card technique within minutes. Jack slipped inside, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain the neighbors could hear it. The kitchen was spotless and warm, with family photos on the refrigerator and Sophie's school schedule posted on a bulletin board. Everything spoke of normal family life, grocery lists, dental appointment reminders, a teenager's part-time job schedule at the local bookstore. Jack moved through the house like a ghost, searching for anything that might reveal the truth about Sophie's past. Her bedroom was on the second floor, decorated in shades of blue and purple, with posters of bands he didn't recognize and photos of friends from school. Her desk held textbooks and college brochures. She was apparently planning to study nursing, like her adoptive mother. It was in Margaret's bedroom that Jack found what he was looking for. Hidden behind a loose board in the back of the master bedroom closet was a fireproof box containing documents that Margaret Hartwell clearly never wanted anyone to find. The first item was Sophie's original intake file from New Beginnings, but this version was complete and unredacted. Jack's hands shook as he read details that Linda Vasquez had never been allowed to see. The child found wandering in the Phoenix parking lot had been wearing a purple sweater, the same color and style as the one Lily had worn to school on the day she disappeared. She'd been clutching a small stuffed elephant that she refused to let anyone take away. Mr. Peanuts, Lily's beloved stuffed elephant that had disappeared along with her, but it was Margaret's personal diary that contained the revelation that changed everything Jack thought. He knew about his daughter's disappearance. The entry was dated November 15th, 2012, 3 weeks after Sophie's placement with the Hartwells. "I know I should have told David from the beginning, but I was afraid he wouldn't understand. When I saw Jane at the emergency foster placement, I recognized her immediately from the missing child reports that had been circulating for months. This was Lily Rowan, the little girl from the news stories who'd vanished without a trace, but she wasn't the same child who'd disappeared. This little girl was traumatized, terrified, and had clearly suffered experiences that no child should endure. When I tried to talk to my supervisor about identifying her, I was told to mind my own business and focus on providing care, not investigating backgrounds. I made a decision that night that I've questioned every day since. I could report what I knew and send this broken little girl back into a system that had already failed her. Back to a father who might not be equipped to handle her trauma. Back to a life that had somehow led to her disappearance in the first place. Or I could give her a chance to heal in a home where she would be safe and loved. Unconditionally, I chose to keep silent. The official story is that Jane Doe 47 was an abandoned child with no family looking for her. The truth is that I know exactly who she is, and I've made the conscious decision to let Lily Rowan become Sophie Hartwell. Her father appears to be a single man, struggling with his own demons after losing his wife. What kind of life could he provide for a child who wakes up screaming every night and can't bear to be touched by strangers? I tell myself I'm protecting her. Most days, I believe that's true. Jack sank to the floor of Margaret's closet, the diary falling from his nerveless fingers. Margaret Hartwell had known from the beginning that Sophie was Lily. She'd made the conscious decision to keep his daughter rather than return her to him, believing she was protecting Lily from further trauma. The rage that filled him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This woman had stolen 11 years of his daughter's life, 11 years of watching her grow up, 11 years of birthdays and graduations and bedtime stories. She'd let him suffer the agony of not knowing what had happened to his child, while she raised that child as her own. But as the initial fury faded, Jack found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. The Margaret Hartwell described in these diary pages wasn't a kidnapper or a child trafficker. She was a woman who genuinely believed she was acting in Lily's best interests, protecting a traumatized child from returning to a situation that might not have been stable enough to provide the intensive care she needed. And she might have been right. Jack thought about the man he'd been in 2012, devastated by Emma's death, struggling with depression and alcohol, barely functional enough to maintain employment. Would he have been able to handle a daughter who'd returned with severe trauma and amnesia? Would his own emotional instability have made Lily's recovery more difficult? He continued reading through Margaret's diary, finding entries that chronicled Sophie's slow healing over the years. December 2012. Jane is starting to respond to her new name. She's asked us to call her Sophie, after a character in a book we read together. It feels like a new beginning for all of us. March 2013. Sophie had her first full night of sleep without nightmares. David cried when we heard her laughing at cartoons this morning. She's becoming the child she was meant to be. September 2014. Sophie's therapist says she's made remarkable progress. Her memories of her life before may never fully return, but she's built new memories that give her joy and security. I know I made the right choice. June 2016. Sophie asked me today if I thought her first family ever thinks about her. I told her that anyone who had known her would never stop loving her. It's the most honest answer I could give without breaking the promise I made to protect her from a past that could destroy her. Peace. Jack wiped tears from his eyes as he read about his daughter's journey from traumatized victim to confident teenager. Margaret Hartwell had given Lily something he might not have been able to provide: professional therapeutic support, stable family structure, and the patience to let her heal at her own pace. But she'd also stolen his chance to be the one providing that healing. The last relevant entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. A man has been watching our house and following Sophie. I hired a private investigator to identify him, and the results terrify me. It's Jack Rowan, Lily's biological father. He's found us somehow, and I know it's only a matter of time before he discovers the truth. Sophie has a good life. She's college-bound, emotionally stable, and surrounded by people who love her. Learning about her past could destroy everything she's built. But I also know that her father has spent 11 years searching for her, and he deserves to know she's alive. I don't know what to do. David doesn't know the full truth about Sophie's background. I've let him believe the official story about her being abandoned. Telling him now would mean admitting to 11 years of lies. But keeping silent means continuing to deny a father his child, and a child her true history. I've sent warnings hoping to discourage his investigation, but I can see in his eyes that he's not going to give up. Maybe that's what a good father would do: refuse to stop searching, no matter what obstacles appeared in his path. Jack closed the diary and sat in the silence of Margaret Hartwell's bedroom, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. Sophie was definitely Lily, but she was also definitely happy in her current life. Margaret had made an impossible choice 11 years ago, and now Jack faced an equally impossible decision about what to do with the truth. He could expose Margaret's deception and demand his daughter back, but that would traumatize Sophie and destroy the only family she remembered. He could keep silent and let her continue living as Sophie Hartwell, but that would mean accepting that he would never have a relationship with his own child, or he could find a third option. one that honored both his rights as Lily's father and her needs as Sophie Hartwell. Jack carefully returned the documents to Margaret's hiding place and left the house as quietly as he'd entered. He had the truth now, but truth without wisdom was just another form of destruction. That evening he sat in his kitchen with his phone in his hand, Margaret Hartwell's work number displayed on the screen. It was time for an honest conversation between two people who loved the same child, even if they'd never met. It was time to decide what was best for Lily, not what was best for the adults who'd shaped her life. Jack called Margaret Hartwell's work number 3 times before finding the courage to speak when she answered. Her voice was professional and warm, the voice of someone accustomed to comforting families in crisis. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Jack Rowan. I think we need to talk about Sophie." The silence that followed lasted so long that Jack wondered if she'd hung up. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely above her. "Whisper, I've been expecting this call for 11 years. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small park on the other side of town, where they could talk privately without risking Sophie overhearing. Jack arrived early and sat on a bench facing the playground, watching other people's children swing and laugh and live their carefree lives. His own daughter had missed this, the simple joy of childhood play in a safe place with people who loved her. Margaret Hartwell approached him slowly, as if walking to her own execution. She was smaller than she'd appeared from a distance, with worry lines around her eyes and graying hair that suggested the weight of carrying secrets. She wore her hospital scrubs, having come directly from her shift. "You know," she said, settling onto the bench beside him, but maintaining careful distance, "I know everything. I read your diary." Margaret's face crumpled. "You broke into my house. You stole my daughter." They sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the enormity of the situation. Margaret was the first to speak. "I was going to tell you. When I first recognized her, I planned to contact you immediately. But then I saw how damaged she was, how terrified and broken, and I thought about what kind of life she might return to." Jack felt his anger flaring again. "What kind of life? You mean with her father who loved her?" "With her father who was drinking himself to death and could barely function," Margaret replied quietly. "I did research on you, Mr. Rowan. I know about your wife's death, your struggles with depression and alcohol, your inability to maintain steady employment. I made a judgment call about what would be best for a severely traumatized child." The words stung because they contained truth. Jack had been barely functional in 2012, consumed by grief and guilt and the crushing weight of losing everything that mattered to him. "You didn't have the right to make that decision," he said. "No, I didn't. But I made it anyway, and I've spent every day since wondering if it was the right choice." Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Jack a photo. Sophie at her high school graduation, radiant with joy and pride, surrounded by friends and family who clearly adored her. "She's graduating valedictorian," Margaret said softly. "She's been accepted to nursing school with a full scholarship. She volunteers at the Children's Hospital and wants to specialize in pediatric trauma, because she says she understands how scared children feel when they're hurt and alone." Jack studied the photo, seeing Emma's intelligence in Sophie's eyes and his own stubborn determination in the set of her jaw. This was his daughter, grown into a remarkable young woman, but grown without him. "She still has nightmares sometimes," Margaret continued, "about a man with dark hair who called her sweetheart and made her feel safe. She doesn't remember the details, but some part of her has never forgotten that she was loved before she came to us." Tears rolled down Jack's cheeks. "She remembers me?" "Pieces, fragments. Her therapist says that early traumatic memory loss sometimes preserves emotional impressions even when factual memories disappear. She knows she was loved, even if she doesn't remember by whom." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small stuffed elephant, worn and faded, but clearly treasured. "Mr. Peanuts," Jack whispered. "She's never slept without him. When she was little, she used to tell him bedtime stories about a daddy who would come find her someday. We thought it was just childhood fantasy until she started describing details that were too specific to be imagination. Jack held the elephant carefully, breathing in the faint scent of his daughter's childhood. This battered toy had been her connection to him throughout 11 years of separation, a tangible reminder that she'd been loved before her world fell apart. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice heavy with emotion. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse, another child's drawing, but this one was recent. Drawn in the careful hand of a teenager rather than the bold strokes of a 6-year-old, the drawing showed a house with a blue door and heart-shaped knocker. But this time it included 4 figures, Margaret and David Hartwell, Sophie, and a man with dark hair standing slightly apart from the group. At the bottom, in Sophie's neat handwriting, were the words, "My 2 families." "She drew this last month," Margaret explained. "She said she dreamed about it and needed to get it down on paper. I think some part of her knows there's more to her story than what we've told her." Jack studied the drawing, amazed by its similarity to the one he'd found in Lily's bedroom. His daughter had been drawing families and houses her entire life, trying to piece together the fragments of her identity. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want what's best for Sophie. And I hope, that might include knowing who you are." Margaret's voice broke as she continued. "I've loved her as my own for 11 years. She calls me Mom, and I've earned that title through every scraped knee and broken heart and proud moment. But I also know that she's your daughter, and you've suffered every day of those 11 years not knowing what happened to her. So what do we do?" "I don't know. This isn't a situation covered in any parenting manual." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Sophie is 17. In 8 months, she'll be 18 and legally able to make her own decisions about who she wants in her life. Maybe we introduce you gradually, let her get to know you before we tell her the whole truth. And if she chooses to stay with you, then we respect that choice. And if she wants to rebuild a relationship with you, we figure out how to make that work too." Jack looked around the park, watching families navigate the normal challenges of childhood, scraped knees and playground disputes, and the eternal struggle to get children to eat their vegetables. His situation was anything but normal, but maybe normal wasn't what mattered. "There's something you should know," he said finally. "I found a letter hidden in Sophie's room, in Lily's old room. She must have written it before she disappeared." Jack pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a photo he'd taken of the letter years ago. In Lily's careful 6-year-old handwriting were the words, "Dear real Daddy, I hope you find me someday. I will try to remember you. Love, Lily." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "She never forgot you. Even when she couldn't remember your name or your face, she never forgot that she had a daddy who loved her, and you gave her parents who loved her too. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough." They talked for 2 hours, working through the logistics of a situation that had no precedent and no clear solution. Margaret would talk to David about Sophie's true identity, a conversation that would reshape their marriage and their understanding of their daughter. They would consult with Sophie's therapist about the best way to introduce new information about her past. Most importantly, they would let Sophie control the pace and extent of any relationship with Jack. "I need you to understand something," Margaret said as they prepared to leave. "If we do this, if we tell Sophie who you are, there's no going back. Her life will never be the same, and neither will ours. I understand. But Margaret, I need you to understand something too. I've spent 11 years wondering if my daughter was dead or suffering somewhere. Finding out she's alive and loved, that's a gift I never expected to receive. Whatever happens next, thank you for taking care of her when I couldn't." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She's an amazing young woman, Jack. You would be so proud of who she's become." "I already am." That night, Jack sat in his kitchen with Mr. Peanuts on the table in front of him and Sophie's letter in his hands. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin the process of telling her family the truth about Sophie's identity. Tomorrow, Jack might finally have the chance to speak to his daughter for the first time in 11 years. He thought about Emma and what she would say about the impossible situation they found themselves in. She'd probably point out that sometimes the best solution wasn't the cleanest one, and that love often required sharing rather than possessing. Jack picked up his phone and called Sarah Martinez to tell her the investigation was over, not because they hadn't found the truth, but because they'd found something more important than truth. They'd found a way forward that honored everyone who loved Sophie Hartwell, the remarkable young woman who used to be Lily Rowan. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "You could pursue legal action, demand immediate custody transfer, make Margaret pay for what she did, and destroy my daughter's life in the process? No, this isn't about what I'm legally entitled to. This is about what's best for Lily, for Sophie." Jack ended the call and spoke once more to Emma's memory. "I found her, Em. Our little girl is safe and loved and everything we would have wanted her to become. Tomorrow I get to meet her again. I think you'd be proud of the choice I'm making." Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythms. Tomorrow would bring challenges and conversations and emotions that none of them were fully prepared for. But tonight, for the first time in 11 years, Jack Rowan went to sleep knowing exactly where his daughter was and that she was loved. Margaret Hartwell's phone call came at 7 in the morning, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "Jack, we need to meet today. Sophie found my diary last night." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. All their careful planning about gradual introductions and controlled revelations had just been destroyed by teenage curiosity and a hidden diary that hadn't been hidden well enough. What happened? She was looking for her birth certificate to complete her college financial aid forms. "I'd moved the documents to a different hiding place after your break-in, but I forgot to move the diary with them. She found it in my old spot and read everything." Jack's mind raced. How did she react? "She's not speaking to me. She locked herself in her room and won't come out. David is devastated. He had no idea about any of this. Our entire family is falling apart. Where do you want to meet?" "She knows about you, Jack. She knows your name, where you live, everything. I can't control this situation anymore." Jack looked out his kitchen window at the quiet morning street, imagining his daughter somewhere across town, processing the revelation that her entire life had been built on lies. She was probably feeling betrayed, confused, and angry, emotions he understood all too well. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be here when I try to talk to her. She has a right to hear your side of the story. And I hope, that meeting you might help her understand why I made the choices I did." 3 hours later, Jack stood on the front porch of the house he'd been watching from a distance for weeks. The blue door with its heart-shaped knocker looked exactly as Lily had drawn it 11 years ago. But now he was here as an invited guest rather than a desperate observer. Margaret answered the door, looking exhausted and defeated. Her eyes were red from crying, and her usually neat appearance was disheveled. Behind her, Jack could see David Hartwell sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "She's upstairs," Margaret said quietly. "She knows you're coming." Jack's phone was already recording when Margaret led him to the living room. Sarah Martinez had insisted he document whatever conversations took place, not for legal purposes, but to ensure everyone's words were preserved accurately for whatever came next. "Before we go upstairs," Margaret said, "there's something else you need to know. Sophie has been keeping her own secrets." She handed Jack a small wooden box, the kind teenage girls used for jewelry and treasured keepsakes. Inside were items that made Jack's breath catch: a faded photo of him and Emma from their wedding day, a hospital bracelet from when Lily had her tonsils removed at age 4, and a child's drawing of a man pushing a little girl on a swing. Where did these come from? She's been collecting them for years. Somehow she kept these few things from her life before, hidden even from us. The photo was in her pocket when she was found in that parking lot. The hospital bracelet was sewn into the lining of her backpack. The drawing, she must have done that from memory after her amnesia began to lift. Jack studied the drawing, recognizing the park where he used to take Lily every Saturday morning. She'd drawn it with remarkable accuracy, including the specific swing set they'd always used and the oak tree where they'd had picnics. She remembered, he whispered. more than we realized. When she read my diary last night, she told me that she'd always known there was something missing from her life. She said the memories felt like dreams she couldn't quite grasp. Margaret wiped her eyes and continued. She wants to see you, Jack, but she's also angry and hurt and confused. This conversation could go in any direction. They climbed the stairs together, Margaret's footsteps heavy with dread. She knocked softly on Sophie's bedroom door. Sophie. Jack is here. Come in, came a voice from inside, young, clear, and unmistakably his daughter's. Sophie was sitting on her bed, still in pajamas, with Margaret's diary open in her lap. She looked up when Jack entered, and the resemblance to Emma was so strong that he felt dizzy. But her eyes were his, dark and intelligent and currently filled with a mixture of pain and curiosity. "You're my father," she said without preamble. "Yes," Jack replied, his voice barely audible. "You're Lily, my daughter." Sophie studied his face carefully, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with fragments of childhood memory. "I remember your voice. In dreams mostly, but sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear someone calling me sweetheart, in a voice that sounds like yours." Jack felt tears threatening and fought to maintain composure. This was his daughter, older, changed, but unmistakably the little girl he'd lost 11 years ago. "I never stopped looking for you," he said. "I never stopped believing I would find you. Margaret says you've been watching our house." Sophie's tone was neutral, but Jack could hear the underlying tension. "I found a drawing you made before you disappeared. It showed this house, and I couldn't understand how you'd known about a place you'd never been." I was desperate for answers. Sophie reached into the wooden box and pulled out another drawing, one Jack hadn't seen before. It showed the same house, but this version included a fourth figure standing on the sidewalk, looking at the family in the yard. "I drew this 2 weeks ago," Sophie said. "I kept dreaming about a man watching us, and I needed to get it out of my head. I think some part of me knew you were there." Margaret moved closer to the bed, her maternal instincts overriding her own emotional turmoil. "Sophie, I know you're angry with me." "Angry?" Sophie's composure cracked. "You lied to me for 11 years. You let me believe I was abandoned when I had a father who was looking for me. You stole my entire identity. I thought I was protecting you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You were so damaged when you came to us, so afraid and broken. I looked at your father's situation and made a judgment about what would be best for your recovery." Sophie turned to Jack, her eyes blazing. "What was your situation? What made her think you couldn't take care of me?" Jack wanted to sugarcoat the truth, to present himself in the best possible light. But his daughter deserved honesty, even if it was painful. "Your mother, Emma, died of cancer 2 years before you disappeared. I was drinking too much, barely functioning, struggling to keep my job and take care of you. When you vanished, I fell apart completely. Maybe Margaret was right to think I wasn't capable of helping a traumatized child. But I was your child," Sophie said quietly. "Your traumatized child. Yes, and losing you nearly destroyed me." Sophie looked back and forth between Jack and Margaret, processing the complexity of a situation that had no clear villains or heroes. "So what happens now? Do I have to choose between you? Do I go back to being Lily Rowan, or do I stay Sophie Hartwell?" Jack had been dreading this question, knowing that his answer would shape the rest of their relationship. "You don't have to choose anything. You're 17 years old, about to start college, with a life you've built here. I'm not going to disrupt that. What do you want then?" "I want to know you. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. But I don't need to be your only family." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, studying the diary in her lap. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "I used to have dreams about you. About a man who would push me on swings and read me bedtime stories and call me sweetheart. Margaret and David have been wonderful parents, but there was always this feeling that someone was missing." She reached into the wooden box one more time and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old and worn from repeated handling. "I wrote this when I was little, after I came to live here, but before I stopped remembering you clearly." Jack unfolded the paper and read the careful words. "Dear real Daddy, I hope you find me someday. I will try to remember you. I love you even when I can't remember why. Love, Lily. The letter he'd found years ago in his daughter's old room had a companion, proof that even in her new life, some part of Lily had never stopped believing in their connection. Sophie set down the letter and looked directly into Jack's eyes for the first time since he'd entered her room. The moment stretched between them, father and daughter recognizing each other across 11 years of separation and change. I remember making pancakes with you, she said suddenly. Saturday morning pancakes with faces made out of blueberries. You always let me help even though I made a mess. Jack's heart nearly stopped. You remember that? Pieces. Fragments that come back sometimes when I smell certain foods or hear particular songs. Sophie's voice grew stronger as the memories surfaced. You sang to me at bedtime. Something about sunshine and rainbows. You are my sunshine, Jack whispered. Your mother used to sing it to you, too. Emma. Sophie spoke her birth mother's name carefully, as if testing how it felt. I remember her hair, golden like sunshine, and she smelled like lavender. Margaret sat quietly in the corner, watching her daughter reconnect with memories that had been buried for over a decade. Her face showed a mixture of pain and wonder, pain at seeing Sophie remember a life that excluded her, wonder at witnessing the power of love to transcend time and trauma. There's more, Sophie continued, reaching deeper into the wooden memory box. I've been saving these for years, not really understanding why they were important. She pulled out a small silver locket that Jack recognized immediately. It had been Emma's, passed down from her grandmother, and she'd given it to Lily for her 6th birthday, just months before her disappearance. I never took this off, Sophie said, opening the locket to reveal a tiny photo of Jack and Emma on their wedding day. Even when I couldn't remember who these people were, I knew they were important to me. Jack stared at the locket, amazed that his daughter had managed to keep this connection to her original family through all the chaos and confusion of her disappearance and placement. You wore it all this time? Under my clothes, so no one would ask questions about it. I told Margaret and David it was just a lucky charm, but really it was like an anchor to something I couldn't quite remember but couldn't let go of either. Margaret spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice thick with emotion. I always wondered about that locket. You were so protective of it, but you never wanted to talk about where it came from. Because I didn't know where it came from, Sophie replied. I just knew it was mine, and that losing it would mean losing something essential about myself. Sophie stood up and walked to her desk, where she pulled out a thick folder. After I read Margaret's diary last night, I stayed up researching everything I could find about my disappearance. I found newspaper articles, police reports, missing person flyers with my picture. She handed Jack a printout of one of the flyers, Lily's school photo above the word missing in bold red letters. Jack had distributed thousands of these in the weeks after her disappearance, posting them on every telephone pole and bulletin board in the county. This little girl looks so happy, Sophie observed. Was I happy before everything happened? You were the happiest child I've ever known, Jack said, his voice breaking. You found joy in everything. Raindrops on windows, dogs at the park, stories before bedtime. Your mother used to say you had enough happiness to light up a whole city. What happened to me, Jack? How did I end up in that parking lot in Arizona with no memory of how I got there? It was the question Jack had been dreading because he still didn't have a complete answer. The police never found out exactly what happened. You disappeared between the school bus and our house, just vanished without a trace. The investigation suggested you might have been taken by someone, but there was never enough evidence to pursue specific leads. Sophie returned to her bed and picked up Margaret's diary again, flipping to an entry Jack hadn't seen during his break-in. According to this, when I was found, I had signs of having been living outdoors for an extended period. Malnourished, dehydrated, with cuts and bruises that suggested I'd been surviving on my own for days or weeks. Margaret nodded reluctantly. The medical reports indicated you'd escaped from wherever you'd been held and were trying to make your way home when you were found. The trauma of that experience was what caused your memory loss. So I wasn't abandoned, Sophie said, her voice growing stronger. I was kidnapped, and I fought my way back. Jack felt a surge of pride despite the horror of what his daughter had endured. You were always brave. Even as a little girl, you never backed down from challenges. I wish I could remember more about what happened during those missing months, Sophie said. But maybe some things are better left forgotten. She walked to her window and looked out at the yard where Jack had watched her playing just days ago. I like my life here. Margaret and David have been good parents to me. But I also feel like I've been living someone else's story, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense, Jack replied. You've been Sophie Hartwell for 11 years, but you started as Lily Rowan. Both of those identities are real and valid. Sophie turned back to face them, her expression showing a maturity beyond her 17 years. I want to know both sides of my story. I want to remember Emma and learn about the family I came from. But I also don't want to lose the family I have now. Margaret stood up abruptly, tears streaming down her face. Sophie, I need you to know how sorry I am. I thought I was protecting you, but I was also protecting myself. I fell in love with you the moment you came to us, and I was terrified of losing you. You're not going to lose me, Sophie said firmly. You're my mom. You raised me, loved me, helped me heal from whatever happened to me. That doesn't change just because I remember having another family before. She looked at Jack with Emma's intelligent eyes and his stubborn determination. And you're my father, my biological father, who never stopped looking for me. I want to get to know you again, but I need to do it slowly, on my own terms. Jack nodded, understanding that this remarkable young woman needed to control her own healing process. Whatever pace feels right to you. I've waited 11 years. I can wait as long as you need. Sophie walked over to her dresser and picked up a framed photo of herself with Margaret and David at her high school graduation. Then she reached into the memory box and pulled out the faded wedding photo of Jack and Emma. I want to put these together, she said, placing both photos side by side. My two families, the one I was born into and the one that saved me. She looked around the room that had been her sanctuary for 11 years. Then back at Jack with a small smile that reminded him powerfully of Emma. I think I'd like to start calling myself Lily Sophie, she said. Not quite Lily Rowan and not quite Sophie Hartwell, but something that honors both parts of my story. Jack felt his heart expand with a joy he'd thought he'd never experience again. His daughter was alive, safe, loved, and ready to bridge the gap between her two identities. It wasn't the reunion he'd imagined during 11 years of searching, but it was better, more complex, more real, more respectful of the life she'd built. Lily Sophie sounds perfect, he said. Margaret wiped her eyes and managed a shaky smile. It sounds like exactly who you are. Someone strong enough to embrace all the love you've been given from all the people who care about you. Sophie, Lily Sophie, picked up Mr. Peanuts from her memory box and hugged the worn elephant to her chest. I think it's time to stop hiding parts of myself. I want to remember everything I can about being Lily, and I want Jack to know everything about who I became as Sophie. She looked between her two parents, biological and adoptive, with the wisdom of someone who'd survived trauma and found healing. We're going to figure this out together, all of us. It might be complicated and messy, but I think good families usually are. 6 months had passed since that emotional afternoon in Sophie's bedroom, and Jack Rowan was learning that rebuilding a relationship with his daughter was nothing like the reunion fantasies he'd nurtured during 11 years of searching. It was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more rewarding than anything his imagination had conjured. Lily Sophie, she'd legally changed her name to honor both her identities, was finishing her senior year of high school while slowly integrating Jack into her life. They met for coffee twice a week, attended her school events together, and spent Saturday mornings at the same park where they'd once fed ducks and pushed swings. The memories came back gradually, in fragments and flashes that filled in the spaces between past and present. The Thanksgiving photograph, sitting on Jack's mantel, told the story of their unconventional family better than any words could. It showed 5 people around a dinner table, Jack, Lily, Sophie, Margaret, David, and Mrs. Chen, who'd become an honorary grandmother to everyone involved. They were all smiling, but it was the comfortable, imperfect smile of people who'd worked through difficulties and chosen to build something new together. Margaret had struggled the most with the revelations and changes. Learning that David felt betrayed by her 11 years of lies had nearly ended their marriage. But couples counseling and David's gradual understanding of the impossible position Margaret had found herself in had slowly rebuilt their trust. David, it turned out, was a man of deep compassion who could forgive deception born of love, even when that deception had shaped their entire family life. The hardest part, Margaret had told Jack during one of their monthly coffee meetings, was accepting that I'd made the right choice for the wrong reasons. Sophie needed the stability we could provide, but I also needed to feel like I was her real mother. I was protecting her, but I was also protecting my own fears. About losing her, Jack had come to understand that Margaret Hartwell wasn't a villain in his daughter's story. She was another parent who'd made impossible decisions under extraordinary circumstances. Her choice to keep Lily had been wrong in many ways, but it had also saved his daughter's life and given her the therapeutic support she'd needed to heal from whatever trauma had befallen her during those missing months. The investigation into Lily's original disappearance had never been resolved. Detective Sarah Martinez had reopened the case briefly, but after 11 years, most leads had gone cold. The prevailing theory was that Lily had been taken by someone passing through the area, held for an unknown period, and had either escaped or been abandoned before making her way to the Arizona parking lot where she was found. The gaps in her memory meant they might never know the complete truth about those missing months. Maybe that's for the best, Lily Sophie had said during one of their Saturday morning walks. I've learned to live with not remembering everything about my past. Some mysteries don't need to be solved to be healed from. Jack's relationship with his daughter was different from what it had been when she was 6. She was almost 18 now, with her own opinions, dreams, and plans for the future. She'd chosen to attend nursing school in the fall, a decision influenced by both Margaret's career and her own desire to help children who'd experienced trauma. She was confident, intelligent, and remarkably well-adjusted for someone who'd survived such extraordinary circumstances. I've been thinking about the drawing that started all this, Lily Sophie said, as they sat on their favorite bench in the park. The one I made when I was 6, showing the Hartwell house. I think some part of me always knew I would end up there, like I was drawing my future home instead of remembering a place I'd been. Jack considered this possibility. Or maybe you drew it because you needed to believe you'd find safety somewhere, even when you couldn't remember where you'd come from. Either way, it brought you to me. After 11 years, a child's crayon drawing led my father home. They developed new traditions together. Saturday morning pancakes with blueberry faces, just as they'd done when she was little. Evening phone calls when she needed advice or just wanted to hear his voice. Family dinners that included both sets of parents and often Mrs. Chen, who'd become the glue that held their extended family together. The most surprising development had been David Hartwell's relationship with Jack. The two men had bonded over their shared love for Lily Sophie and their determination to support her college dreams. David had even offered Jack part-time work doing home renovations, recognizing that Jack's construction skills and attention to detail made him a valuable partner. It's strange, David had confided to Jack during one of their work projects. I spent 11 years being Sophie's father, but I never thought about the father she'd had before me. Getting to know you has helped me understand parts of her personality that never quite made sense. Her stubbornness, her loyalty, her absolute refusal to give up on things that matter to her. Mrs. Chen had perhaps the most philosophical perspective on their situation. Families are like gardens, she told Jack one evening as they watched Lily, Sophie, and Margaret plant flowers in the front yard together. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens are the ones that grow in unexpected ways. with different plants supporting each other instead of competing for the same space. The new family portrait, the artifact that now anchored Jack's understanding of his place in the world, had been taken just last week at Lily, Sophie's high school graduation. It showed her in her cap and gown, surrounded by all the people who'd played a role in raising her. Margaret stood on one side, David on the other, with Jack and Mrs. Chen completing the circle of love that had sustained her through 17 years of life. In the photo, Lily Sophie was holding two things: her diploma and the small stuffed elephant that had traveled with her through every phase of her journey. Mr. Peanuts looked a bit worse for wear after 17 years, but he remained a tangible link between the little girl who'd disappeared and the young woman who'd been found. Jack kept Emma's ring in a special box now, along with the original drawing that had started his search and the letters Lily had written to her real daddy during the early years of her placement with the Hartwells. These artifacts told the story of a family torn apart by tragedy and reassembled through love, patience, and the refusal to give up hope. As autumn approached and Lily Sophie prepared to leave for college, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them back together. He'd started his search believing that finding his daughter would restore his old life, but instead he'd discovered something better, a new life that honored both the past they'd shared and the future they were building together. "Are you ready for me to go away to school?" Lily Sophie asked him the night before she left for orientation. Jack looked at his daughter, confident, beautiful, and ready to take on the world, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the people who'd helped her become who she was. "I'm ready for you to chase your dreams," he said. "I'll miss you terribly, but I'm not afraid of losing you anymore. I know who you are now, and I know you'll always find your way back to the people who love you." Lily Sophie hugged him tightly, and for a moment Jack could feel the ghost of the 6-year-old who used to fall asleep in his arms after bedtime stories. "Thank you for never stopping looking for me." "Daddy," she whispered, "thank you for never stopping believing I would find you." "Sweetheart." The next morning, as Jack watched Lily Sophie drive away to begin her college adventure, he felt Emma's presence like a warm wind. Their daughter was safe, loved, and ready to change the world. She carried pieces of all the people who'd shaped her: Emma's kindness, Jack's determination, Margaret's nurturing spirit, and David's quiet strength. Mrs. Chen joined him on the front porch as they watched the car disappear around the corner. "She'll be back for Thanksgiving," she said, with the practical wisdom that had guided him through the darkest years of his life. "I know," Jack replied, "and Christmas and spring break and all the holidays that matter. We're a family now, all of us, in all our complicated, imperfect glory." He looked up at the house where he'd raised Lily for her first 6 years, then across the neighborhood towards Sycamore Lane, where she'd grown into the remarkable young woman she'd become. 2 houses, 2 families, 1 daughter who'd been loved enough to heal from unimaginable trauma and strong enough to bridge the gap between her 2 worlds. Jack Rowan had spent 11 years searching for his missing daughter. What he'd found was something even more precious, a family that proved love could transcend time, distance, and even the worst circumstances life could devise. Some stories didn't have neat endings, but the best ones had new beginnings that honored everything that came before. The heart-shaped door knocker that had started it all still gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. No longer a mystery, but a symbol of the home where his daughter had learned to feel safe again. And in his own home, Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator once more, not the desperate scribbles of a lost child, but the confident artwork of a young woman who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged.